Night my daughter called to tell me she'd set a place for her mother at Thanksgiving, I almost said no. Not because I was angry. I'd stopped being angry somewhere around year 3 after the divorce, when I realized that holding on to it was like gripping a fishing hook. The only person bleeding was me. I almost said no because I genuinely didn't know what we would talk about. 62 years old, and I still hadn't figured out how to sit across from the woman who'd looked me dead in the eyes on a Tuesday afternoon in February and said, "You know what your problem is, Vic? You've never been anything without me propping you up." She'd said it like she was doing me a favor, like the truth was a gift she was generous enough to give. My daughter's name is Cora. She was 26 at the time, working as a physical therapist in Asheville, North Carolina, living in a little apartment with a yellow door that she'd painted herself on a Saturday in April. She called me every Sunday at 7 in the evening, without fail, because that's the kind of person she is, steady, deliberate, built for the long haul. She got that from me, or so I like to think. She wanted one Thanksgiving where both her parents were in the same room. Just one. "Dad," she said, "I'm not asking you to forgive her. I'm asking you to pass the green beans." I laughed. I couldn't help it. "Fine," I said. "I'll come. Let me back up. My ex-wife's name is Renata. We married in 1989, when I was 27 and she was 24, in a church in Knoxville, Tennessee, with her mother crying in the front pew, and my father standing beside me smelling like Old Spice and motor oil. I remember thinking I was the luckiest man alive. She was sharp and funny and had this way of tilting her head when she was listening to you, really listening. That made you feel like the only person in the world who had ever said anything worth hearing. We were good for a long time. I want to be honest about that. This isn't a story where I was perfect and she was a villain from the start. We raised Cora together. We bought a house in Maryville with a deck that I built with my own 2 hands one summer, board by board. Because we couldn't afford to hire anyone, and I'd watched enough YouTube videos to be dangerous with a circular saw. We had dinners and fights and years that blurred together the way years do when you're inside them. But somewhere in the middle of it all, Renata decided I wasn't enough. Not in a way she ever said clearly. It came out in other ways. In the sighs when I talked about my woodworking, which I'd been doing out of our garage since our 30s, making furniture, small pieces, cutting boards and tables and the occasional chair. She called it a hobby. I thought of it as something closer to a calling. That difference mattered more than either of us admitted. I was working for a flooring company at the time, project manager, decent salary, nothing spectacular. We were comfortable, but Renata had started spending time with a couple she'd met through her book club, a lawyer and his wife. Big house in West Knoxville, the kind of place with a circular driveway and a wine refrigerator in the kitchen. I think that's when the measuring started. Not against anything real, against an idea. She began making comments about our neighborhood, about the car I drove, a 2003 F-150 with 140,000 miles on it that I loved like a member of the family, about how other husbands had moved up faster, moved further. I'd try to explain that I was happy, genuinely happy, with the work I was doing, with the projects I was taking on, with the pieces coming out of my garage that I'd started selling at local craft fairs on weekends. She'd listen with that same tilt of her head, but the expression behind it had changed. One afternoon, a few months before she told me she wanted a divorce, she came into the garage while I was finishing a side table. Cherry wood, hand-cut dovetail joints took me the better part of 3 weeks. She looked at it for a moment, then looked at me. "You know," she said, "some men use their free time to get ahead." I didn't say anything. I kept sanding. The divorce was civil, in the way that divorces can be civil when both parties are tired enough. We split things down the middle, sold the house. Each tickle was ours. I moved into a 2-bedroom rental on the east side of town. Cora was 20 at the time, already away at school, old enough that I didn't have to worry about custody arrangements, but young enough that I could see how much it cost her to see us separated. Renata remarried within 2 years. A commercial real estate developer named Philip. I'll give him his name because he wasn't a bad person, just someone she decided fit the version of life she wanted. They moved into a house in a development with a name like Creekside Bluffs or Whispering Falls, one of those places where everything is beige and the lawns are identical. And somewhere in the transition, the story Renata told about our marriage changed. I heard it through Kara first, in fragments, that I'd held Renata back, that she'd been the one keeping things together while I played with wood in the garage, that my lack of ambition had been the real problem all along, and she'd been patient far longer than most women would have been. I heard it from her sister once at a family event I was still invited to in those first awkward years. The sister didn't say it meanly, she was just reporting what she'd been told. But the picture she described didn't sound like my marriage. It sounded like a story someone had constructed afterward to make sense of a decision they'd already made. The version where I was, the problem was tidier. So that's the version that spread. I won't tell you it didn't bother me. It bothered me the way a stone in your shoe bothers you, not enough to stop walking, but always there, making every step slightly wrong. I thought about calling people. Correcting the record, writing something down and sending it to the people whose opinions I cared about. I didn't, partly because I didn't know what I'd say, partly because I've never been a man who talks a lot about what's going on inside him. Kara calls it my superpower and my flaw in equal measure, and partly because I figured the truth was patient. It would wait. The year after the divorce, I did something I'd been thinking about for a long time. I left the flooring company. I want to say it was a bold decision, a moment of clarity, a pivot point. The truth is messier than that. My position was restructured, which is a corporate way of saying they needed someone younger who'd take less money, and instead of job hunting in an industry I'd spent 20 years in and never loved, I sat in my rental apartment for 3 days and thought about what I actually wanted to do with whatever time I had left. I was 53 years old. I had a reasonable severance, no debt except a modest car payment on a newer truck I'd bought used, and a garage full of tools that had been the best thing in my life for longer than I'd admitted to anyone, including myself. I started Brennan Woodcraft, named it after my mother's maiden name, which felt right in a way I can't fully explain. Just me, a rented workshop space on the outskirts of Maryville, a website my nephew helped me build over a long weekend, and a small portfolio of pieces I'd photographed on a white sheet in my backyard. The first year was lean. I won't romanticize it. I ate a lot of eggs. I drove to craft shows in Virginia and Georgia and Tennessee, loading the truck the night before, unloading alone in the dark before dawn, setting up my booth while other vendors were still parking. I sold enough to keep going, not enough to feel secure, but something was happening that I couldn't quite see from inside it. The pieces I was making were getting better. Not because I was trying harder, but because I had time, real time, unhurried time, to learn. I started taking on commission work, a dining table for a family in Knoxville, a built-in bookcase for a retired teacher in Gatlinburg, a set of kitchen cabinets for a couple renovating a farmhouse in the Smoky Mountains foothills. Each one taught me something the last one hadn't. By the end of year 2, I had a waiting list. 6 months. Then 12. I hired a part-time assistant, a young man named, well, I'll call him my apprentice because that's what he became, who showed up knowing nothing about woodworking and left 3 years later knowing more than most people twice his age. I also bought land, 7 acres outside of Maryville, not far from the Little River, in a part of East Tennessee that still looks the way the whole place used to look before the outlets and the traffic. I'd been saving since the divorce, quietly, without telling anyone, not because I was planning anything in particular, but because the habit of saving had always been the thing that steadied me. The land had an old farmhouse on it, barely livable, structurally sound, bones that were good if you looked past the surface. And I looked past the surface. I spent 18 months renovating it myself, on weekends and in the evenings with help from a contractor friend who kept shaking his head at what I was doing with the interior woodwork. White oak floors that I milled from timber harvested from the property. A kitchen with hand-built cabinetry in a warm walnut that I finished myself. A screened porch on the east side with Douglas fir beams that I'd sourced from a reclaimed lumberyard in Chattanooga. Cora came for a weekend in August, when the interior was about 70% done, and walked through every room without speaking. Then she stood in the kitchen, ran her hand along the edge of the island I'd built, and said quietly, "Dad, this is incredible." I said I knew it still needed work. She said, "That's not what I mean. I'm telling you all of this because I want you to understand what Renata walked into that Thanksgiving. Not a performance, not something I'd staged for her benefit. She walked into 7 years of quiet work, done without announcement, without anyone watching, without any particular thought of what she might one day think of it. That's the part that matters most. It wasn't built for the moment she saw it. It was just built. Cora had made the invitation, and Renata had accepted, and I drove up from my workshop the morning of Thanksgiving in the truck with a sweet potato casserole I'd made from a recipe my mother had written on a notocard sometime in the 1970s. The handwriting was faded. I'd kept it in a kitchen drawer for 30 years. I heard her car on the gravel before I saw her. I was on the screened porch with my coffee, watching the morning fog on the lower field. Not nervous exactly, just quiet. The way you get quiet before something you can't entirely predict. She came round the side of the house to the porch steps. She was 60 now, same as me essentially, and she looked well. I'll say that because it's true, and because I'm not interested in pretending otherwise. She stopped at the bottom of the steps. She looked at the porch, the beams, the tongue-and-groove ceiling I'd done in white pine, the view of the field and the tree line beyond it. She said, "Is this the right place?" "Yeah," I said. "Come on up. Coffee's hot." She came up the steps slowly, looked at the rocking chairs I'd built, matching pair, red oak, took me most of the previous winter, looked through the screen at the field. Then she turned and looked at me. "Victor," she said, "this is yours." "Mine," I said. She was quiet for a moment. "Then," I said. She was quiet for a moment. "Then, I didn't know," I said. "Come inside. I want to be fair about what happened next, because I think fairness is the only thing that makes a story like this worth telling." She didn't fall apart. Renata was never the kind of person who fell apart. She walked through the house the way she used to walk through everything, taking it in, composing her reaction, deciding what to say. She asked about the floors. I told her I'd milled them myself. She asked about the kitchen cabinets. I told her the wood came from a walnut tree that had been on the property. She stood in the doorway of what I use as a study. Bookshelves floor to ceiling, all built in, everything fitted. And she didn't say anything for a long time. Cora was in the kitchen starting on the turkey, and I could hear her moving around, giving us space without making it obvious she was giving us space. Smart kid. Finally, Renata said, "Your work did this." "My work did this," I said. She nodded once. That was all. We had a good Thanksgiving, actually. Not warm exactly, not like old times. It wasn't supposed to be. But decent. Civil. In the way that means something real, not just the absence of argument. Cora sat at the head of the table and kept things moving the way she always does, easy and sure. Renata asked about my business. I answered honestly, without showing off, without false modesty. I told her about the commission waiting list, the 2 craftspeople I'd brought on, the piece I'd just finished for a hotel lobby in Asheville that had taken 8 months and was, honestly, the best work of my life. She listened. She tilted her head the way she used to. After dinner, while Cora was doing dishes and Renata and I were sitting on the porch in the cooling late afternoon, she said something I hadn't expected. "I told a story about you," she said. "After we split. That wasn't fair." I looked at the tree line. The fog had lifted. It was one of those East Tennessee November evenings where the sky goes amber and rose at the same time and the air smells like wood smoke and cold coming. "I know you did," I said. "I think I needed to believe it," she said, "to feel okay about things." I sat with that for a while. There's a version of me that had a speech ready for this moment, sharp, measured, designed to land. I'd run it in my head more times than I care to admit, back in year 2 after the divorce, when the story she'd been telling about me was still fresh and still stinging. But sitting on that porch in that house, I didn't feel the need for a speech. "People do that," I said finally. "Make the story fit." She looked at me. "You built this in 5 years," she said. 6, I said. "Since the layoff." 6 years, she said, mostly to herself. I said, "You want more coffee?" She said yes. Cora called me the following Sunday right at 7, same as always. "How are you feeling about it?" she asked. I thought about it honestly. "Settled," I said, like something got finished that I didn't know needed finishing. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I wasn't sure if inviting her was the right call. I needed to see you both in the same room. Without it being a battle, I needed to know it was possible." I told her it was possible. "Dad," she said, "did it matter to you that she saw it?" I had to think about that longer than the question deserved. The honest answer is complicated. There was something in me when she stood in the kitchen and ran her hand along that countertop that felt the way the last note of a piece of music feels. Complete. Landed. Done. I won't pretend that didn't mean something. It would be dishonest to say I'd built the life entirely without any thought of what she might have thought, somewhere deep down, if she could see it. But the thing about 6 years of real work is that the work becomes its own reason. By the time Renata walked through that door, the house wasn't a statement. It was just where I lived. The business wasn't a rebuttal. It was just what I did, every day, with all of myself. If she'd never come, it all would have been exactly the same. That's the part I couldn't have told you when I was 53, sitting in that rental apartment, feeling the particular loneliness of having your own life described back to you in a way you don't recognize. I would have said that, yes, it mattered what she thought, and yes, I wanted to be seen correctly, and yes, the unfairness of it kept me awake. Now I'm 62, and I sleep well. It mattered a little, I told Cora. Not as much as I thought it would. She made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh, more like the sound of relief. "I think that's the right answer, Dad. I've had 6 years to find it," I said. "The thing I want to say, if you're at the beginning of something like this, if you're sitting in a smaller place than you used to live, driving a truck with more miles on it than you'd like, hearing a version of yourself you don't recognize being passed around like it's fact, is this, the quietest thing you can do is become undeniable. Not loud about it, not performative, not built for the moment someone sees it and has to reckon with what they said. Just real. Just true. Day after day, doing the work that's actually yours, making the thing you actually know how to make, becoming the person who was always there underneath the story someone else decided to tell. I'm not a man who talks much. Cora will confirm that. I went through the divorce mostly without saying anything I didn't have to say, let the legal process do what it was designed to do, kept my finances clean and my word clean and my hands busy. Some people read that as weakness. Some of Renata's friends, I'm sure, still read it that way, but I built a house out of timber from my own land, and I did it with my own hands, and it sits at the edge of a field in East Tennessee where the fog comes up off the river in the mornings, and there's not a thing in it that anyone can take from me. That's not nothing. I don't know if Renata thinks about that Thanksgiving. I don't know if she revised the story she told or if she kept the version that made her feel okay. I hope she's happy, and I mean that in the plain, undecorated way. I genuinely hope the life she chose is good to her. But I stopped needing her to see me clearly somewhere around year 4. The day she finally did, I was ready to pass the coffee and let it go. That was enough. After everything, that was exactly enough. I've been thinking about what it actually costs to let someone be wrong about you. Not the version where you're noble about it, where you forgive quietly and feel at peace. The real version, where it sits in you like a low-grade fever for years, where you replay the exact words in the dark, where you catch yourself composing arguments to people who aren't in the room. Renata said I'd never been anything without her propping me up. She said it once, to my face, and then she said it 100 more times to people I cared about, in a version of our marriage that I didn't recognize. That cost me something. I won't pretend it didn't, but here's what I've come to understand. Standing on the other side of 6 years of work that nobody was watching, the cost of defending yourself to people who've already made up their minds is higher than the cost of letting them be wrong. Not because silence is the same as acceptance. It isn't. But because the energy it takes to correct a false story is energy you cannot spend building a true one. I chose to build. What came out of that choice wasn't planned. I didn't sit in that rental apartment in Maryville and think, I'll show her. I thought, I have to do something real, or I will lose myself entirely. The woodcraft, the land, the house, none of it started as a statement. It started as the only honest thing I knew how to do. And that, I think, is the only version of any of this that holds up. The things you build because they're true to you outlast the things you build to prove a point. Every time, without exception. There's a kind of intelligence that doesn't show up on any test or resume. It's the intelligence of knowing what you actually are, separate from what anyone else has decided you are. Renata decided I was small. For a while, I almost believed her, not because her version was convincing, but because when someone who shared your life for 20 years tells you a thing, you give it weight you shouldn't. That's not weakness. That's just what it is to have been close to someone. The wisdom is in knowing when to stop giving it that weight. Cora understood something I was still learning when she invited her mother to Thanksgiving. She wasn't trying to force a reconciliation. She was trying to show me that I didn't need to carry the grudge into every room anymore. She was right. When Renata stood in my kitchen and ran her hand along the countertop I'd built from a walnut tree that grew on my own land, I didn't feel triumph. I felt something quieter and more permanent than that. I felt the specific peace of a man who did the work and let the work be the answer. That's the thing about integrity. It's slow. It doesn't give you the satisfaction of a sharp comeback or a courtroom moment. It just accumulates year after year in things that are real and solid and yours. And one day you look up, and the life you built is so clearly, undeniably true that no one's old story about you can find any place to stand. I'm 62. I sleep well. I wake up early, make coffee, and walk out onto a screened porch I built with my own hands to watch the fog come off the river. That's not nothing, that's everything.